kuidas siis ikka rikaste toppi pääseda ja mul on hea meel, et suurinvestor Joakim Helenius, siis Trigon Capitali asutaja ja tegevdirektor on kohal, nii et räägib oma investeerimispõhimõtetest. Palun.
Thank you very much, Anu. And thank you, Juhano, Investor Toomase, for inviting me. I'm particularly impressed as a few months ago, reading Äripäev, I saw a chart showing the people who had made the biggest losses in the history of Estonia in their businesses, investments, whatever. And interestingly enough, I was number one. I had lost, what, 200-300 million euros. So the only reason I can imagine why Investor Toomase decided to invite me to speak was because he believes that people can learn from their mistakes. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but I will do my best to pass on my thoughts on how to invest, how to maybe run your businesses successfully. Very much based on my experiences and learning, hopefully, from my mistakes. I'll speak briefly on equity investments. What it takes to, I believe, be successful in equity investments. Some words on lessons I've learned as an entrepreneur. What does it take to be successful as an entrepreneur? What should you do? What should you avoid? Some thoughts on trends that are likely to impact the world we live in, not only in 2019, but onwards as well, I believe. And a very few words about what I myself will be doing in 2019 in order to make back those 200-300 million euros. Let's start with long-only investments. I know a little bit about this. In Trigon, we manage about €500 million worth of equity investments focused on Central and Eastern Europe. This includes, for example, managing money for the Norwegian oil fund. So we have a little bit of experience in the sector. What is it required to be successful? Like with so much else, I believe it's focus. I can only be astounded by the success of Investor Toomase, who basically follows the entire world, and it shows that focus in basically applying strict discipline to your investment decisions can be successful. Typically, I've found that focus requires also some form of specialization. You can focus on a region, you can focus on a particular country's markets, you can focus on a sector, but you want to focus on something where you build up expertise and experience, know-how. Without this sort of focus, it's very difficult to outperform, in my experience. Once you choose whatever it may be, the sector that you want to focus on, you need to then apply some disciplines, a little bit along the lines that Investor Toomase was outlining. You need to know the companies in your subsector. So it's not enough to just pick one company and decide that you like it. You need to compare that company to other companies in the market, in the sector that you're following or the country that you're following, and you need to somehow convince yourself that the company that you like is better than alternative companies. There are a lot of good companies out there, but if you want to outperform, you have to pick the best of the good companies. It's not enough to just pick a good company. Clearly, you need to know the economies in which these companies operate, because there can be a very good company, but operating in a country where due to reasons that have nothing to do with the actual business of the company, the performance of the stock will be impacted by what happens in the economy in which it's based. You know, there are a lot of very good companies in Brazil Brazil has gone through, hopefully this is changing now, has gone through some really tough times, and even the best companies have underperformed internationally because of the economy. So you need to understand the economies in which the companies that you're following operate, and you need to have an opinion, you need to have a view on what's going to happen to that economy. You know, best time to buy is always when things are at their worst. But how do you determine that? It's very, very difficult, but you have to focus. The trends that drive the markets and drive the economies that we exist in, we live in, are key to investing. Who's to say, you know, how long the hype about, for example, the IT sector, the internet sector, will last? As we could see from Investor Tomas's graphs, the valuation metrics, the price-earnings ratios, the price-to-book ratios have gone up. When people lose interest, when markets lose interest again in these companies, even the best companies will suffer from the fact that the investment metrics, valuation metrics will drop. So, you know, you might have a fantastic company that continues to increase its earnings, but if the sector sees a drop of 50% in the price-earnings ratio or the price-to-book ratios, you might still lose money. So trends are just as important as the companies. So it's combining all these different functions, all these different aspects of investing that basically give you the base on which to build outperformance. Now, I will show you an example of how one can outperform. You know, it happens to be an example that's close to my heart and makes my own company look good, but nevertheless, it's a good example. The Trigon New Europe Fund, which is the sort of the flagship fund, the asset management business, most of the money it manages is in so-called mandates. So, for example, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has not invested into the Trigon New Europe Fund, which basically invests in the countries of Central Europe, the new member states of the European Union. But it's basically invested in the same region, and they follow the performance of our fund because it's a benchmark, and it gives us a way of explaining how we invest and how we're doing versus the competition. As you can see from this chart, the fund has shown, and this is based at the end of October in 2008. So after the big sell-off that came with the crash, the September crash of 2008. So this is already, the performance already includes that, although the markets kept falling after that. So of course it makes it look a little bit better than if we had taken 2 months earlier. But the point here is not the absolute performance. The point is the relative performance. How did this fund compare to all these other funds managed by all kinds of well-known asset management companies and banks on a relative basis, and how did it perform versus the index, versus the index being the average, when you take all the stocks in these markets and you look at their average performance, it basically constitutes an index. Well, the index showed a performance over this 10-year period of 43%, and the fund showed a performance of 192%. There is an ETF. A lot of people, when they invest into equities these days, they like to invest into ETFs because ETF is a way of tracking the index. So if you want exposure to a particular region, put money into the ETF, and you will pay lower fees to the management company. Well, the ETF showed a performance of 34%, which is basically 43% minus management fees. Of course, there were quite a few fund managers who actually showed even much worse performance, but it shows also that there were a lot of fund management companies whose funds actually outperformed both the index and the ETF. And this was through focused stock picking. If you basically buy into the argument that in many cases it makes more sense to invest into funds than it does to invest into specific stocks, and that's an individual choice, then basically what you should, I think, look at is not the company that's managing a fund, but the fund manager is managing the fund. So in our case, we have an individual who's been working for us for 15 years or more, who's been managing this fund throughout this period, called Mehis Raud, who's an extremely focused and good investor. As you can see, not only is the performance much higher than that of the competition, but the volatility is low, which means that the sort of ups and downs have been, relatively speaking, lower than the ups and downs of competing funds. So, you know, if you were to read if you said, okay, this is really good, maybe I should invest in a fund, and then, you know, a few weeks later you read in the newspapers that Mehis Raud is no longer managing the fund, you should think again maybe, because it's the individual. It's not Trigon that makes this performance so good. It's Mehis Raud who makes it so good. But it shows that focused investing can give you superior returns. All these articles you read in the newspapers, including Äripäev, which question the ability of individual fund managers to outperform indices, to my mind, and here's some evidence, are wrong. They might be more or less right when it comes to extremely liquid and extremely sophisticated markets like the United States, where it's very difficult to be smarter than the others because there are so many smart people who have huge resources behind them, picking stocks every day, trading stocks every day. But when it comes to smaller markets that are not so sophisticated, such as, for example, Central and Eastern Europe, it definitely works. This is also shown by the fact that, and this is just a little bit of a little ad here, Thomson Reuters Lipper is by far the world's largest fund information system. It basically tracks funds throughout the world. Every fund in the world is tracked by Thomson Reuters Lipper, and you can get all kinds of analysis from Thomson Reuters Lippers. To the best of my knowledge, Trigon got this award as the best small equity company group in all of Europe, not Eastern Europe, all of Europe, for the years 2015, 2017. As far as I know, it's the first time that a fund management, asset management company from Eastern Europe has ever received a pan-European reward of this sort. Now, let's move on. That's investing. Covered that. Let's talk about my lessons as an entrepreneur. Do not spread yourself too thin. Just like in investing, focus. People have a habit of thinking that they're smarter than they are. At least, you know, historically, you know, a lot of my mistakes have come down to the fact that I've thought that I've understood something much better than I actually have understood it. Focus is key. Learn what you know, try to understand what you're doing, understand it very well, and probably you'll do okay. Don't try to go and jump at every opportunity you see, changing your views on what it is you really want to do. Stay focused. Very importantly, never leverage unless you have a reliable cash flow to back up the loans you're taking. Don't take loans unless you feel pretty comfortable about being able to service those loans. Do not trust timetables that are dependent on bureaucratic decisions. Again, you know, all of these things are things that I've lost a lot of money on. You know, if you have a project and you're told by all kinds of governments and bureaucrats and whatever that, yeah, we'll get it all. We'll get all the permissions, all the permits done in like 12 months or 18 months or whatever, don't trust them. Never trust governments or bureaucrats or whatever. Always, assume that everything's going to take a lot longer, and if necessary, be willing to pay up to buy something that where all these decisions, these permits, whatever, let's say in property development or something, are all in place. You pay much more for that, but you might be very happy in a longer run that you did so. Only do business with people that you really trust. This is a tough one because it's very difficult to know, can I trust this person in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time? But spend a lot of time thinking about the people you work with, both within your organization and in terms of your business partners. Take your time to really assess whether you can trust them. Because if you basically make a big investment in money or investment in reputation, time, effort, whatever, it is usually based on people, on your partners, on the people who you work with. And if they turn out to be the wrong people, even though you yourself might not have made any huge mistakes, you can still end up very disappointed indeed. Well, if you're successful in your business, here in Estonia is a minuscule market, 1.3 million people. You can't get very far in this market. You can't build a big business in Estonia. You have to go beyond the borders of Estonia if your business starts to pick up momentum. So you start expanding internationally. Exports, or even investments into other countries, production facilities, whatever it may be, service-related, offices. You're moving out of the little country that you know, which is Estonia, into countries that you don't know. Well, it's fine. In my experience, you have to do it, and you should do it, because Estonia is just too small. But try to avoid countries with unpredictable political leadership. My biggest losses by far came from my sort of belief in the fact that agricultural prices, soft commodity prices, food prices were going to rise, and I took a big gamble on agriculture in Russia and Ukraine, and maybe I should have spent more time trying to understand the political risks. In the old days, I always thought everybody talks about political risk, but if you want to do business, you have to, ignore political risk and just take risks. Well, political risk exists in our immediate vicinity, so my advice would be stick with the European Union. Don't go for these sort of these risky countries to the east. Those are just a few points, because nobody can teach anybody else how to be a good entrepreneur. Everybody will basically make their own mistakes. Everybody will build their businesses as they see fit. They can listen to somebody like me talking about the mistakes that they made or the lessons that they learned, but usually they're still gonna make their own mistakes. They're not gonna. But maybe sometimes some of these points stick, and it avoids a mistake that otherwise would have been made. So it's always good to listen. Now, global and regional trends that I believe are going to become increasingly important. This is something I really believe in. In spite of all my losses in agriculture in Russia and the Ukraine, I continue to believe that, I can't say when exactly, but I continue to believe that climate change will eventually force upon us enormous changes in the way the economy out there, the nature works. What I mean by this is that not only will it become more and more difficult to maintain the sort of agricultural output that the world needs for its growing population. And this might not happen in the near future, but sooner or later, because of climate change, we will face a situation where this will be a problem. But the whole agricultural sector is changing. It cannot continue as it is at the moment. So we cannot continue to grow food in a way that is burdening the soil, burdening the environment, the atmosphere, the way it is at the moment. We just cannot do that. I mean, agriculture is as big a producer of greenhouse gases as industry. But nobody talks about agriculture as a producer of greenhouse gases. Everybody talks about industry, everybody talks about transport. This will change. Now, this means that a sector called agtech, which is like, you know, the IT sector was 15 years ago, something that a few people have heard about, but nobody takes that, you know, nobody thinks that it's going to have a huge impact on their own life, their own businesses, the environment they live in. This sector, the agtech sector, is going to become, over the next 10, 20 years, you know, I believe, as big as, in many ways, as the IT sector has been, because it's going to be the solution provider to the problems we will increasingly have in producing food for the world without destroying our environment. The other thing that's happening in this sort of, let's say, the ag sector is that advancing technology is making it possible to produce fuel, like biomethane, which is an even more efficient fuel than petrol or diesel, out of agricultural waste, agricultural output, stuff that can be grown. This means that over the coming 10, 20 years, countries with a lot of nature relative to their populations will benefit. Estonia is one such country. We will be able to, over time, produce more and more of the energy and fuel that we consume locally here in the sort of out of our own nature. We'll become less dependent on imports from abroad and more self-sufficient in energy and transport fuels. So without going into a lot of details, in the future, as you start reading more and more about this, remember, you heard it first here. The competition for increasingly scarce human resources is growing greater and greater. What a country needs if it wants to be successful is basically it needs smart people. It needs people who know what they're doing, who, you know, it needs entrepreneurs, it needs specialists of all sorts. Why is, when we look at small countries, why is Singapore so successful? Or in Europe, why is Luxembourg the richest country in Europe on a GDP per capita basis? Because they're open to immigration. They bring in smart people, they bring in smart entrepreneurs, specialists, whatever it may be, that help them, you know, help their economies become super successful. Why is the average Luxembourger so much richer than the average German or Scandinavian? Because of all these smart people from all over the place who have moved to Luxembourg because of the incentives even that Luxembourg has given them. The average Luxembourger is no smarter than the average German or the average Scandinavian. But the country has opened itself up to immigration. That's what's done it. If one doesn't do it quickly, we will run, if Estonia doesn't open itself up quickly, we will run out of people. We think at the moment that there are endless numbers of Ukrainians just waiting to move to Estonia. Rubbish. Estonia is definitely not the first choice for Ukrainians who want to move out of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian economy is now growing again, and it will become less and less interesting for Ukrainians to move abroad. The people and the countries who attract these immigrants now are the ones who will benefit from that in the future. And those countries who refuse to do that, they will find that when, in the future, when suddenly we desperately need immigrants, we desperately need to attract entrepreneurs or specialists, suddenly there's nobody left because the more dynamic countries have grabbed them all. They've attracted them all. And, you know, and as you know, in the world, if you're not growing, you're shrinking. This is what everybody says: artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and blockchain technology, and so forth. I'm not going to talk about it because I don't, you know, I think it's a huge trend, but I don't understand it well enough to talk about it. One thing, the last point I'm making here is, and this is partly to do with whether or not we're open to immigration and whether or not we're open to the world in a sense as an economy. The world is already dividing up into laggards and dynamic winners. And I'll show you some comparisons, like pairs of countries. Look at Estonia versus Greece. In 2010, Greece had 2 times the GDP per capita that Estonia had. Estonia was just a poor little Eastern European country with, you know, compared to rich Western European Greece. Today, or 2017, Estonia had already surpassed Greece, which, as we all know, has had big problems, and where GDP per capita dropped dramatically. This shows what happens if you just go crazy on borrowing money and without thinking about whether or not you're going to pay back. Russia versus China, same thing. Russia is a laggard. The Russian economy is in stagnation. China is dynamic. China will soon overtake Russia. Just as importantly, Estonia, which 7-8 years back had a GDP per capita comparable to Russia, is today has a GDP per capita 2 times greater than Russia. We're talking about integrating the Russian minority, the Russian ethnic minority in Estonia. The bigger that difference between Russia and Estonia, the easier it will be to integrate the minority. This isn't talked about, but it's all about how successful the economy is. Why would Russians want to live here, want to move to Russia? You know, Russia is a stagnant, poor country. And the more they think like that, the more they'll be willing, I hope, to integrate into the mainstream Estonian society. The last example here is just long term. Believe it or not, but in 1960, Ghana in Africa had a higher GDP per capita than the Republic of Korea. In 1960. Today, the Republic of Korea has a GDP per capita that's, 20 times higher. You know, correct, forward-looking economic policies allow businesses to grow, allow entrepreneurs to be successful, allow investors to make money, and push economies forward. You know, let's not be a Ghana, let's be a Korea. I'm basically out of time, so I will just very briefly show that as far as my own plans are concerned, I want to, you know, stay true to the lessons I've learned in life. I want to be focused. I want to work especially in one sector I think I know, which is agriculture and agriculture related. I'm working on ag tech. I've got 3 projects running. Whatever I'm doing though, I want to stay focused. Thank you very much.
Joakim Helenius, thank you so much. Kas kellelgi on üks kiire küsimus veel, soovib keegi küsida? Jaa, palun.
Thank you for the presentation. At least I will try to keep in mind your future predictions. Let's see how they go. You mentioned the immigration and Luxembourg and Scandinavia and Germany, and how the immigration increases or puts the economic growth in a turbo mode. At the same time, those exact mentioned countries like Sweden and Germany are per capita one of the biggest takers of immigrants. How that fits in the picture where Luxembourg is more successful than exactly those named countries like Sweden and Germany? Thank you.
I'll be a little bit controversial. Luxembourg has been very successful at selective immigration. You know, they have been very good at attracting, for example, financial back office related businesses together with all the specialists that this entails to Luxembourg. So it's been a focused immigration. Of course, they've accepted, you know, just regular immigrants as well. The problem, when, you know, as I see it, having lived most of my life in Western Europe, 8 years in Germany and God knows how many years in the United Kingdom, the way I see immigration is that there is good immigration and there is not so good immigration. I mean, you know, if Ukrainians move to Estonia and are allowed to settle here, I think within one generation they will be indistinguishable from Estonians. I even believe that from what I can see, and there are a lot of Ukrainians working from the various businesses I'm involved in, I even believe that, you know, they're a totally different kettle of fish from, let's say, you know, some of the older ethnic Russians who don't want to learn the language or anything. I think these people want to learn the language, they would put their kids in Estonian language schools and they would be fully integrated. If you bring in large numbers of people who are culturally too different, you bring in numbers that are too large within a short space of time. I'm talking about especially the sort of the biggest problem we've had in Europe with Muslim immigrants. Muslim immigrants come in, they come from a totally different cultural sphere, and they tend to want to live together, and so what tends to happen is they start forming ghettos, which means that it's very difficult to integrate them. We have big problems with Muslims in Russia, in France, in Germany, in Scandinavia. If you read, you know, what's happening in Finland, it's like this culture clash with young Muslim men. You know, there are very few Muslim women, I guess, you know, causing all kinds of problems. So let's be clever about immigration. Let's bring in the immigrants who can really help the country without leading to sort of big problems in terms of cultural clashes.
Thank you. And the last question, very brief. You're so sexy.
You're
so sexy. Successful. So we all admire you. I'd like to ask, what kind of car do you actually have? The most expensive in the world, probably.
No, I have a very, 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 very old Mercedes.
Why? Why it's not Tesla or something like that?
No, because I really like classical things. So I have an old sports Mercedes, silver colored. I call it my silver beauty. That's 35 years old.
Thank you. Suur aitäh.
Thank you.
Thank you.